When Richard Mallory accepted the position as the new caretaker of Blackwood Cemetery, he saw it as a quiet escape from the chaos of life. Isolated on the outskirts of a forgotten town, the cemetery was centuries old, overgrown, and rumored to be haunted. Richard dismissed the stories as superstition. But soon after taking the job, he began to realize that the graves held secrets more terrifying than he could have imagined. Richard arrived on a cold, misty morning, the iron gates of the cemetery creaking open as he stepped through. The graveyard was expansive, stretching far into the woods where tombstones were worn down by centuries of wind and rain. His small cottage stood on the cemetery grounds, a short walk from the oldest graves. As he settled into his new life, the cemetery was as quiet as he had expected, but there was something in the air, a weight, a chill that never left, even in the daylight. The town had been sparse with details about the cemetery's past, and Richard preferred not to ask. But one night as he patrolled the grounds, he noticed something strange. A grave, one of the oldest, had fresh dirt scattered around it, as though it had been disturbed. No animal tracks, no signs of vandalism, just an uneasiness in the air that made his skin crawl. He brushed it off and returned to his cottage, but the incident lingered in his mind. Weeks passed, and the nights grew colder. One evening, Richard saw something out of the corner of his eye, a shadowy figure standing by one of the graves. Heart pounding, he approached, flashlight in hand, but the figure vanished before he reached it. His breath misted in the air, and the night felt suddenly darker, colder. The next day, he found a headstone he hadn't noticed before. The name was illegible, the stone covered in moss, but fresh flowers lay at its base. No one had been in the cemetery recently, and Richard knew he hadn't placed the flowers. His mind raced, but he told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe a local paying respects. But that night the figure appeared again. This time, it spoke. "Help me." The voice was a faint whisper carried on the wind. Richard turned, seeing the translucent figure of a man standing by an unmarked grave. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, and his hand reached toward Richard as if begging for salvation. Then, just as quickly, he was gone. The apparitions became more frequent. Each night, more and more figures emerged from the mist. Some stood silently at their graves. Others whispered their tragic stories, all pleading for help. Richard could barely sleep, haunted by the faces of the dead, their sorrow palpable. One spirit, a young woman in a tattered white dress, came to him every night. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They took me," she whispered. "They buried the truth." Richard tried to ask what she meant, but she would always fade before giving more details. Each night she repeated the same cryptic warning, urging him to uncover the truth buried beneath the graves. Richard couldn't ignore it any longer. He began to research the cemetery's history and discovered a disturbing pattern. Blackwood Cemetery had once been a burial ground for the town's outcasts, criminals, the forgotten, and those who had been wrongfully accused. There had been no justice, only secrecy. Determined to understand what the spirits wanted, Richard ventured into the oldest part of the cemetery, a section overgrown with ivy and forgotten by time. There, hidden beneath layers of dirt and debris, he found a series of unmarked graves. His heart raced as he dug deeper, uncovering bones and old relics that should have long been left undisturbed. But something wasn't right. Among the graves, Richard found a stone with an inscription that chilled him to the bone. "Here lies the cursed, those who defied the order of Blackwood." That night, the spirits were not just restless, they were angry. They swirled around his cottage, banging on the windows, their faces twisted in agony. The woman in the white dress appeared again, but this time, her eyes were hollow, her voice a scream. "You have to stop it! You have to end it!" Terrified, Richard realized that the cemetery was more than just haunted. It was cursed. The restless spirits were not simply wandering souls. They were victims of a terrible injustice, trapped between life and death by an ancient ritual performed by the town's elders. The town had hidden the truth for centuries, and now the dead demanded retribution. Richard's investigation led him to a hidden mausoleum deep within the cemetery, a place no one had entered for centuries. Inside he found a stone altar, stained with old blood. The walls were covered in inscriptions that detailed an ancient ritual used to bind the spirits to the land, ensuring their suffering for eternity. Realizing that the town's leaders had used the cemetery to cover up their crimes, Richard knew he had to break the curse. The spirits grew more violent, their whispers turning into screams, urging him to act before it was too late. But as he prepared to destroy the altar, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was the ghost of the cemetery's original caretaker, a man who had overseen the ritual centuries ago. His face was twisted with madness, and he warned Richard that breaking the curse would unleash something far worse. Ignoring the caretaker's warnings, Richard smashed the altar, determined to set the spirits free. The ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the cries of the dead. The spirits swarmed around him, their faces no longer twisted in pain but in fury. The young woman in the white dress appeared one final time, her face filled with sorrow. "You've released them all," she whispered, tears streaming down her ghostly face. "But not just us." Suddenly the earth split open, and from the graves rose not only the restless spirits seeking justice, but something far darker, a force that had been bound to the cemetery for centuries. The malevolent entity, older than the cemetery itself, had been waiting for this moment, and now it was free. Richard barely escaped with his life. The cemetery was left in chaos, the spirits free to roam, and the malevolent force unleashed upon the town. He returned to his cottage, exhausted, knowing that the battle was far from over. Every night, he can still hear the whispers of the dead calling out to him. Blackwood Cemetery may never find peace, and Richard knows he's now part of its curse, forever tied to the Restless Cemetery. The town, once silent, is now haunted by the truth it tried so hard to bury.